Sometimes might even do a.
Like, okay, how about this? How about that?
Hello? Okay. So thank you everybody for joining us. It's delightful to see such a packed house here, which reflects a strong interest in the topic. My name is Akanksha. I head the nature and biodiversity work at the World Economic Forum, and I will be your moderator today on this session, which is trying to lay the foundations for a high integrity and high governance principles for a biodiversity credits market. And to do that, I actually have a very, very impressive panel here with me. On my left is Anke, who's the Vice President of Climate and Nature Roadmap at Yara. I also have Helen Crowley, who's the Managing Director for Pollination. I have Margaret Kulo, who is the Finance Practice Lead at WWF. And we have Claudia, who is Managing Director of Responsible Investing and Governance at APJ. Thank you so much for joining me. In terms of the flow of this session, I'm going to give you a quick 5 minutes of context setting and where we are coming from, just for you to understand that this is a session which is part of an ongoing piece of work where I see many of you here in the audience are also participating in. We will have about 35 minutes of back and forth of conversation with the panelists as well as a few experts in the audience. And then we will open it up for about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A and really hope that you can make it as challenging and interactive for us because that's the only way we learn and grow. And please note that the session is being live cast. So when you do come in with your questions, would be wonderful if you introduce yourself, name, organization, and just speak very clearly. So thank you. So I think this room is not the place to talk about why nature matters. I mean, we are literally in the pavilion, which is called Nature Positive. But despite so much of the momentum for COP15, and seeing also that nature was a big part of the last two COPs of the climate convention, both at Glasgow and at Sharm el-Sheikh, we are looking at a significant financing gap. Some estimates put it as $711 billion annually. This is all happening in the context where there is fiscal stress on many governments. Money is receding because of rising inflation. So the gap will not get filled by private sector or donor aid money alone. It is understood that we need greater public-private collaboration, models of blended finance, and an ability to think about nature differently. We do not have representation today, unfortunately, from members of the indigenous people and local community. Our panelists had to pull back last minute because of health issues. But some of us were part of a small huddle session 2 days ago, and we heard very loud and clear that our relationship with nature, which has been so extractive to date, is not working anymore. We have to shift the way we look at nature, perhaps in the same way that the world evolved when it came to issues of child labor, slavery. No business today, no individual today would want to be associated with any piece of product or service that is connected with human rights violation. We need to be able to safeguard similar rights for nature. And how do we do that? We have to think outside of the box. Do we value nature? Do we remunerate people who actually safeguard nature? And how do we also prevent the loss of nature and finance which is going into those activities? Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is being negotiated here, will set the signal for the rest of the world on why and how to act on nature. But the teeth to that GBF will come from how much money is put behind it, its implementation. And I hope that through this panel, we are able to at least tease out some ideas which give us a direction of the work for the next 2 years or more. At the World Economic Forum, along with many partners and collaborators, the last 6 to 8 months, we have been pulling together ideas and thinking on biodiversity credits. we released a high-level briefing paper in September during the UN General Assembly week, which was really a top-level C-suite briefing on what do you even mean by biodiversity credits? Are we just actually adding more complexity? Don't we already have carbon credits? So that paper just sets out why we need different sort of credits for nature and biodiversity. Since then, in September, we have been looking at the piece in 3 different working groups. First one is really looking at demand and supply. So why would corporates and investors actually want to buy biodiversity credits? Since we have been very clear that biodiversity credits are not offsets. So it really has to be seen as an investment into nature. So what then is the business case for buying those biodiversity credits? The second is a group which is looking at high integrity governance and principles for this market, learning from what worked and honestly what did not work in the carbon credit space. And one of them was that it focused so much on the need to the purchase that we forgot about how do we engage with the natural and people assets on the ground who safeguard it. So I'm really delighted that we actually have Margaret here on the panel, because Margaret has been co-leading that working group along with Martine from Pollination. And then the third working group is really looking at some sort of a pilot. And many of us have been dreaming of creating a coalition of the willing or coalition of the first movers, which can in 2023 bring together about 6 to 8 investors and corporates who would be willing to buy these credits, and 3 to 4 high integrity projects on the ground, which promise protection, restoration, and sustainable management with local community. So I think more to come on that later, but today we'll speak a little bit more about this piece of work. So moving to the panel, if I could actually invite you, Margaret, first. Speak to us a little bit about your work at WWF, as well as a little teaser for the audience on the paper that I just very shortly mentioned. It's not for this audience, it's not new that the latest WWF Living Planet report shows that since 1970, just less than 50 years ago, we've had 70% decline in wildlife population. Something needs to change. Can financing actually help bridge that gap?
So thank you very much, Kanksha, and thank you very much for including us in the conversation. And yes, it's true that this is not an audience that we have to speak to very much about why this is so important, but there are a couple of statistics on biodiversity that I want to start with. Then I want to talk a little bit about the financing gap, and then talk about why this work in particular is interesting as it relates to those two things. So first, as Akanksha mentioned, the Living Planet Index showed we've seen a reduction in the average size of vertebrate population since 1970 of almost 70%. It's even more marked for, in Latin America, it's more than 90%, and in freshwater, it's something like 83%. So really significant declines in the average size of vertebrate populations. And as those of you who work on this issue every day know well, that is more, it's just as much a indicator of what's happening in those ecosystems as it is a specific look at specific species. So this is a signal to us from the planet that our ecosystems are really in crisis. If you look to the IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, global assessment just a couple of years ago, they also showed that there are about 1 million species at risk of extinction, many including in our lifetimes. The other thing that report looked at, which I think we don't pay enough attention to, but I really invite you to read the summary for policymakers. They looked at what that means for delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. And something like 80% of the targets they measured under the Sustainable Development Goals are also at risk with that level of biodiversity loss. So clearly what we're looking at is not just a signal from the Earth about what's happening, but also a signal back to what that's going to mean to us. That's the Sustainable Development Goals on health, on poverty, on food, all across the spectrum. So if you look at one more linkage, the IPCC sixth assessment report looked at, now this one I misquote, so I'll have to look. This one looked at the overlapping challenges between climate, nature, and people. So it was the Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability report. And they found there's something like 3.3 to 3.6 billion people who live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. That's almost half of the world's population today. This is not what's coming, but what's happening today. They live in areas with problems with access to water, and they have disproportionately climate-sensitive livelihoods, so agriculture, for example. Now, they also tend to coexist in places where you've got high levels of poverty and weak governance. So again, back to the linkages of all of these issues, climate, nature, people, yes, we've seen in the Living Planet Index a reduction in the average population size of vertebrate populations. That's appalling. But we're also seeing those impacts across the ecosystem into our own lives. To the financing gap, there's roughly a $700 billion, now there's lots of ways to measure, as those of you who follow this, the financing gap on biodiversity, about a $700 billion gap on every year on biodiversity. A big proportion of that gap could be filled by less money flowing to things that actually harm biodiversity. So the amount of funds that flow to harmful subsidies dwarf the amount of funds that flow to biodiversity. We also know from the UNEP's report, the UNEP Finance Initiative report just last week on the state of finance for nature, that a gap for nature-based solutions, we need to double the funding for nature-based solutions in particular today. So we hear a lot over the course of last week, and certainly we'll hear more this week, about the need as we align finance to both green finance, so reduce the flows of funds to the things that harm nature, and also finance green, increase the flow of funds to things that support nature. And this work really clearly falls in that last category. The two challenges that we're most interested in this work are, first, you can currently get economic value or financial value from nature by extracting it. And sometimes you can get financial value from restoring what you've just extracted. It's extremely difficult to get financial flows to not extract in the first place. It's hard unless you can prove you're about to cut down this tract of forest, or that you've cut it down but you would like to rebuild it, to get a flow of funds. That's a perverse incentive to get money to the places we know we need to protect and conserve. So that's one of the challenges that we are trying to address with this area of work. The second, it's really difficult to get the funds to the stewards of nature themselves, which in most ecosystems is indigenous peoples and local communities. We've got big flows of funds that go to governments. We've got big flows of funds that go across economies, and it's a huge challenge to get it into the place where the resources are not being extracted, where they're being stewarded, where they're being conserved, where they're being protected. So those two big challenges, how we address getting flows of funds to places where we can see the need for conservation, we see the need for preservation, restoration, and how we get funds to the ground, to the stewards of nature. And those are what we're most interested in seeing. We need to start this conversation, unlike in the climate space, with the integrity discussion. We don't want to back into, now how do we get integrity in the conversation? We need to start with, what does integrity look like around a biodiversity credit? So the three principles right now that we're working around are, and I have a draft in front of me because otherwise I can't, transparency and sound governance, equity and inclusion, rigorous measurement, reporting, and validation. So those are the integrity principles around which we're trying to start this conversation about what does a real biodiversity credit, whether we call it something else, because credit has so much baggage. That's the nature of the conversation. Thanks, Akanksha.
Thank you so much, Margaret. There's so many things that I want to come back on. Least of all, the name. I think everybody's been giving us feedback that stop calling it biodiversity credits because it automatically means offsets. Is it really nature-based? So I think definitely. You talked about the linkage of biodiversity with all other goals and why we need to safeguard it. I'd like to now come to Helen. To also understand just why would businesses be interested in the first place. And you've been working with us on this topic for months now, and it seems to have moved very quickly from thought leadership to actual investment. So what are some lessons that you are hearing from business partners that you work with?
Okay, thanks. Great to be here. Thank you so much. And lovely that there are so many people. I can see the question time is going to be very exciting. Let me just talk about a couple. I just sort of want to build on what Margaret said. So we got into this and got really involved with WEF and with many others in this space a few months ago, as Akanksha said, partly because we saw a couple of paradoxes, right? On the one hand, incredible interest in biodiversity credits from corporates, from investment community. What is this new thing? Can this be, a thing? Can it be a thing? What is it? And that interest sort of came out, on the other side of the paradox, came out of the fact of the voluntary carbon markets and the carbon markets, and we've done a lot of work, decades of work in that space. If you added up everybody in pollination, it's probably centuries of work, but in those markets. And then we were also seeing, through our clients and our other work, this incredible interest. So there was sort of like, okay, this is great, there's interest, but we want to learn, we know what worked and didn't work is still in work in progress with carbon, so we want to sort of get it right. So that was sort of one level of the paradox that we wanted to start sort of unpacking and thinking about. And the other level is the huge potential, to what Margaret said, the huge potential for this to be a new type of flow of finance or vehicle, if you like, to inclusive, equitable nature outcomes on the ground. That was the end goal, and that these credits were going to sort of be a vehicle. So huge potential to do that, partly because we've got these new people engaged. We've got new stakeholders, new people engaged in this, new investment, new money, new ideas, and so on. Okay, so we've got this, and we have much more technology now to be able to track flows of finance and trying to. So that's exciting, but at the same time, we don't have any rules for the game, really, because we should be thinking out of the box and not just reinventing what has happened before and think, we did that in carbon, good, bad, ugly, whatever. What are we going to do here that gets us those outcomes? What's different? What's more powerful? And so on. So because of that sort of two levels, we wanted to really dive in and work with a multi-stakeholder group and say, okay, what are the new rules of the game? And what are those rules? What is that integrity and those principles that we need across quite a complex flow? So there's, what does a credit look like? And we're going to hear more about that. There's some great thinking already about how do you define uplift in biodiversity or avoided loss. How do you do that? And how can you parcel that as something that is value, is equity in an intact system or an improving system, or however. And then how do you verify that, and who verifies that? And then what are the claims that are being made by the buyer? And what's the structure for those claims? And then there's a piece in the middle, which is the primary market and then the secondary market on trade. Who trades? What are the claims that are made around those trades? And so on. And we can go into more detail about that, just sort of laying out. So while you have these integrity principles that Margaret outlined, we've also got to apply them across quite a complex market. So that's what we're doing now all together, and that's probably why this room is packed, because you all probably have some people have very strong opinions about this, and we're going to hear about that. But, and just the final thing, just on the offsets, and let's just put it, the credits in inverted commas. So we really want, while offsetting has a place, and we've done many decades of work, some of you in the room I can see, on a site-based offsets, right? When you have an impact and you use the mitigation hierarchy and you work through the mitigation hierarchy and you can have an offset, right? And like for like, and we've spent a long time talking about that. And there are policy enforced offset markets for biodiversity in the UK and Australia and so on. So there is a space there, right? And that's a separate discussion to what we're talking about here, which is more, I guess, equivalent, if we wanted to say, to the voluntary carbon space, which is not about offsets, but it's about a different space of how do we flow that money to this, to these outcomes we want, and what are the claims you can make about that, and how do we validate those claims?
Thank you. I'm really happy the theme that is building up here is one on integrity and the desire to make sure that the outcome is positive for people on the ground, the ones who are safeguarding nature, as well as I really liked what Margaret, you also tried to clarify, is we have to build a market that also rewards intact nature. Because today it's just very difficult to have intact nature and livelihoods actually get remunerated for. Just continuing the discussion, and Claudia, coming to you, oftentimes there are two groups. There are people from finance, and then there are people from conservation. And yes, there is a need to bridge, but we rarely speak the same language. And it's always like, oh, you finance people, investor people, what would it take for you to invest? So if I may put like a very broad question to you, as somebody who is championing responsible investing in APG, what would it take to actually enter the space of biodiversity?
Yeah, thank you very much. And you asked me also to perhaps spend a few minutes on who we actually are. So we are a pension fund investor. We invest $600 billion on behalf of Dutch pension funds. So they also own us. So we are a very long-term investor across private markets and public markets. So it's equities, it's fixed income, but it is also real estate and infrastructure investments. So we are not the kind of investor, we're not a bank who would provide loans, but we're also not a project finance type of investor. And being a pension fund investor with a very long-term horizon, but also with a huge duty to those on whose behalf we invest, we're also very much regulated in terms of what we can and can't do. And given our size, there are also investment opportunities that we can seek have to have a certain scale. And so I don't think we'd be the first one to invest into biodiversity credits. However, we are very committed to nature and addressing that and biodiversity in our portfolio. And that's perhaps where I could spend a few minutes on. And I should say that our CEO, he also chairs the Biodiversity Finance Advisory Committee of the WEF. So he himself is very committed. ABP, who is our largest client and majority owner, they have framed their investment policy within transitions, and that includes climate, and that includes natural resources as well as human rights. So what we are doing is we're using the Encore tool to heat map our entire portfolio, to really identify where are the biodiversity hotspots, biodiversity risk hotspots. We are then supplementing that with a lot of geospatial data to really go deep into our investments, what are the risks that they are exposed to, what do we have to do there. Then this morning, Nature Action 100 was launched. That is a collaborative initiative. It was a soft launch, so the details are still to be worked out, but in principle it follows the concept of Climate Action 100, which is a collaborative initiative for investors jointly to engage with those companies who either were the highest emitting linked to climate or yet to be defined have the greatest impact on biodiversity. And it is the stewardship that we use when engaging with our investees, whereby we can help drive change. And that is where I think, a lot of the corporates that we invest in, they will be investigating whether to use biodiversity credits. It could be part of their climate strategy, it could be part of their nature strategy. So that's where it is relevant for us, and we will definitely enter the discussion about what is the integrity of the credits that you use, how do you apply them, are they really additional, does it would it have otherwise not occurred? So that those are the sort of meaningful discussions that we intend to have. And there are other tools that we as investors can use, and one of them is also to invest into solutions. We have a very strong commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, whereby ABP wants 20% of its assets under management to be invested in investments that actively contribute to the SDGs. And as you already said, that 88% of the SDGs, 80% of the SDGs would be affected by or at risk by the biodiversity loss that we see. So there's a very strong connection to that.
Thank you. And also just thank you for explaining the signal that comes from investors. I feel sometimes we are so focused on the near-term, short-term investment opportunity or financing opportunity, we forget that there is a signal which has to happen. And I think the launch of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures just in the past few months has completely shifted the game in terms of how corporates are starting to also look at biodiversity-related risks and shifting their money into more nature-positive activities. Anke, coming to you now, because we are thinking a lot about intact nature, restored lands and oceans, but a big part of the driver for nature loss is agriculture, but also a significant population in the world relies on agriculture. So how can biodiversity credits or biodiversity considerations actually benefit farmers on the ground, and how can we shift agriculture, which is a driver of nature loss, into something which actually becomes a force for good?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's the first COP I'm attending, and I have heard already so many important messages. Just want to try to add something to it. Yara is on its way to net zero and nature, and to contribute to nature positive, while also supporting the profitability of farmers. This is key, because farming is a business. And we are proud to be part of the food system, and I think it's the most important system we have on Earth. But we need a system change. There is no space for unsustainable business anymore on this planet. And we all need to work together, and we all need to contribute where we have our main competence. And Yara has its main competence in crop nutrition, products, and also services. And we are also willing to go beyond. So we are taking care of clean ammonia, soil health initiatives, and also including water into our solutions. What we always need to have in mind is that farmers are bringing the biggest change and having the biggest capacity to do good, because they are stewards of land. But what we are asking farmers is to change, and they are managing a running machine which has been optimized during decades. And now we are asking farmers to do changes on this running machine, and they are aware that their living depends on the outcome of this machine. And we should always be aware of that, because every change comes with an investment and also with a risk. And they are also basically aware that they can do more, but they need also to be enabled to do that. So basically, all revenue streams we can develop for farmers to do good, to build up their confidence that this is really possible, to go through the transformation period without losing basically their business, is welcome. And biodiversity credits or carbon credits are very important revenue streams for farmers to provide this commitment and to catalyze the change. And this has to come very soon, because we have only 7 harvests left until 2030. And farmers need to plan and they have to prepare also knowledge-wise and technology-wise for the change. And they need first the financial commitment. So we are really in a hurry. We can't discuss these systems for much longer. And I see that we have to learn on the go. We cannot start with a perfect system at the beginning, but we can start somehow. And we know that some things are really good overall. So let's start with soil fertility or soil health. We know that this is a very important contribution to the climate, but also to the biodiversity of nature. Soil biodiversity is an important asset for all of us, and it's also important for food security on a long term. So here we know what is good for soil health. Why don't we just start with that one? We also know that nutrients are important for our food security, but we have also problems with nitrogen. We have overuse of nitrogen. But there are solutions to manage nitrogen much better, more efficient, within the planetary boundaries. So why don't we encourage farmers to do that and enable them also to finance this change and make it happen for them? Because this will be good for climate, nature, farmers' prosperity, and for all of us, because it's also providing food security. And what we also need to recognize is that the farmers' realities are very different. Sometimes you hear this, yes, and after 5 years it's all paying back. Yeah, for some farmers this is the case. But how can we know that the business case for all farmers is positive after 5 years, before we have not tried it? So I have studied horticulture science. I know about many crops, and these crops are all different. We have also a changing climate. This will change a lot. So we should not make assumptions too early. We should be optimistic. It's possible. But we should also be aware that there might be a need for continuous revenue streams for farmers, which are coming on top of their yield revenue streams. Credits are catalyzers. Yes, they are required. But ecosystem services might need incentives over a longer term. So I think we need to bring this finance to farmers, unlock also the capacity farmers can bring for nature and climate. And also the World Economic Forum has a very good initiative. It's a carbon plus farming initiative, where we had a lot of dialogues with farmers and also a farmer survey in Europe. This has brought also deep insights. They are ready to get started. They are proud of what they are doing. But they are business people, and they are living on it. So let's make farmers businessmen and treat them also accordingly. Agriculture is a business opportunity. And for sure, we need to work together. Collaboration, digitalization is key to get this up to speed and also to the scale we need. And digitalization brings also a lot of opportunities for transparency and trust-building initiatives. We can bring a lot of knowledge to farmers in a kind of affordable way, because also smallholders, they might have access to smartphones or other devices. And Yara is translating all the crop nutrition knowledge into digital tools and services to make it affordable and accessible for farmers. This is important. Knowledge, technology, and the commitment that this is really working out for them. That is what we have to bring to the table. Many thanks.
Thank you so much for making it so real, Anke. And I mean, isn't that the dream, that you make sure that the farmer not only gets remunerated for the potato or the apple that he or she is growing, but also the ecosystem service that is provided on the farm. I would like to also bring a little bit more dose of reality, because I'm sure many of you would be wondering, yeah, but a carbon is a carbon. How do you actually look at a biodiversity unit? What does a project actually look like? And can it realistically be scaled, yes or no? So I'd like to invite two people who have been engaged in our work so far. And maybe just invite them also to give us a view on the science, but the application on the ground as well. But while I do that, could I get a quick sense of, and you don't have to do it all at once, but after that we would like to go into Q&A. So if some of you could raise your hand so I know after those two interventions who to come to, would be wonderful. So just feel free to raise your hands if you'd like to come in with any questions. Fantastic. So maybe if I could invite Dr. Tim Coles first and then Mariana, that would be great. And the camera's over there.
Right, thank you. So we've got a requirement to get about $700 billion, probably most of it from the private sector in order to plug this sort of biodiversity gap. At the moment, we've got about $18 billion coming from private sector, so a massive gap. And one of the reasons for that is because we can't or haven't been able to quantify what a biodiversity unit of uplift is or avoided loss. If we can solve that, then we can start working on the same sort of terms as they do in the carbon markets. So how are we going to do it? Well, firstly, you can't do it by finding an indicator species. It's impossible. There are 1,300 ecoregions. There's no species that occurs in all 1,300 ecoregions, let alone changes in the same direction as all the other species you want it to change into. So the solution, we think, is to look at the Consumer Price Index, which is a basket of goods and services that every country prices up every year and then looks at how much inflation there's been over that year. And every country in the world does that, and we compare those inflation rates around the world. But every country uses a different basket of goods and services. And the reason they do that is because that's what they're buying, so you want to quantify that. Well, why not use the same approach for conservation? Why not have a basket of metrics that reflects the conservation objectives for the habitat and the ecoregion in which you're working? So you have a minimum of 5 of these metrics. You can have more, but a minimum of 5. Now, a metric is an entire taxa. So it's a functional taxa like soil biodiversity, or it's a zoological taxa like butterflies. And you look first at what species you've got, and each of those species has got to be weighted by their importance. And you do it on a 5-point scale. And so you can use the IUCN threat category. So if it's critically endangered, it's a 5. If it's a least concern, it's a 1. But try and use national systems wherever possible for the importance values. But we heard before, 70% decline in populations of species. So abundance and biomass is just as important as the presence of rare species. So there we have a system where you weight each species by its abundance, well, it's a relative abundance between times, or relative biomass between times, on a 5-point scale. So for each species, you multiply the importance by the abundance stroke biomass, sum them up for that taxa. And what you're looking for then is between times a change, an increase in those taxa. Each one will have a different percentage change, but if you take the median one, you then have a way of expressing the overall improvement or avoided loss in biodiversity, and you can then define it as a 1% increase or avoided loss in the median value of a basket of metrics per hectare. So you've now got a definition in exactly the same way as you have for carbon, which allows you to then utilize that in the same way. So does it work? Well, so far, I work for Replanet, and we've managed to get financial commitments for 5 million biodiversity credits on numerous projects around the world. There is a big demand from the private sector that are looking for this sort of opportunity. They want, if they're going to put money into something, they want to quantify exactly what the benefits are they're getting in terms of biodiversity uplift, and this is one way in which it can be done.
Thank you so much, Tim. I also do want to say that as a coalition that many of us are working on from the World Economic Forum, we recognize there have to be multiple methodologies and there have to be multiple products. So I do also want to invite Mariana from Terrasos to just give a sense of both the methodology, but maybe a little bit of a flavor of the projects on the ground as well.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Mariana Sarmiento. I'm the CEO and founder of Terrasos. We're a Colombian company. We have 2,500 hectares under management. We manage those hectares under a mechanism called habitat banking. And some of those habitat banks we've designed so that they deliver biodiversity, voluntary biodiversity credits. For us, it's simple. Each biodiversity credit represents 10 square meters of a threatened habitat that has been conserved or restored and that will be preserved or maintained for at least 30 years. Credits can only be sold once, because in the end, what we want is to increase the footprint of these projects and these kinds of landscapes. Let's see, what else? Pricing, for us, pricing comes down to at least, so there would be a floor price that is represented pretty much by the net present value of all the direct and indirect costs of managing that project plus the cost of capital, right? So that would give us our floor if people want to pay more, and if we can get companies to pay more for that, we're super happy. And everybody will be, so, and then there's that benefit sharing conversation. So how does that revenue get allocated among the different stakeholders that participate in these projects? In some situations, we have landowner partnerships where the landowners will be part of the project partners. In other cases, and depending on what the interest of those landowners is, it'll be more or less like a lease, like a long-term lease. And we need to be mindful that different contexts, different landowners will want different things, and there are different motivations. And that's why it's really important to look at a biodiversity credit market, trying to understand what those local contexts look like. So one of the things that we're seeing in Colombia is a lot of generations, new generations, that don't have any interest in taking care of that land, and they just want to sell it. So there are two options. Do they sell it to somebody? I mean, they're going to sell it to the highest bidder, right? So can we come in and provide a solution and provide a revenue stream that is competitive for those kinds of farmers? Or there's some landowners and stewards and farmers that love their land, that want to continue to do that, and can these credits be a revenue stream that makes sense? So it's not a one solution. There is no silver bullet in terms of how you do these kinds of agreements with landowners. And with also, for example, indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities that have collective titles. That's a whole different story, and we need to figure that one out. So I'll just stop there, but I hope that gives everybody a flavor of what we're doing.
And thanks so much, Mariana. And I think what you said was critical, that every piece of land and coastal area, it's going to be different. And we have to learn to be comfortable with that. I think that's something I learned from Helen a long time back, was nature is complex, and let's be comfortable with that complexity. I'd now like to open it up to Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then we go to quick closing remarks from our panel. So if you want to raise your hands, if I could also invite you to come here so it's visible on the camera. Would you like to stand up? That's okay. Just quickly introduce yourself.
Catherine Early from China Dialogue. I just wondered if it isn't an offset, why do businesses want to invest in it?
Maybe I'll collect 2 or 3 questions and then come to the panel. Yes.
Anne Charline from WWF. How do you foresee the evolution of payment for ecosystemic service credit versus biodiversity credit, as PSE encompasses carbon and biodiversity benefits, whereas biodiversity credit only encompasses credit and would need a total different market for that?
Thank you. Jodie Gunn from the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. I'd just like to understand how you balance the ensuring long-term enduring outcomes for biodiversity with accessibility for individual landholders. Thanks.
Thanks. George Livingston with Cargill. Just wanted to ask about the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem function. It's not always a positive relationship, and I'm curious if, anyone's thought about how to integrate that into situations where you might want to maximize particular ecosystem functions and also biodiversity in those systems, where they are not positively correlated.
Great. Who wants to take, especially the question on why would corporates buy, maybe?
I can comment on the balance. What
Okay.
you just mentioned. Yes, there are compromises we have to make. Agriculture is basically also actively fighting against biodiversity. I mean, this is a fact. We have crops on our ground and we don't want to have other things growing, and we need to find good solutions how to find the right balance. And I think land sparing and land sharing opportunities have to be applied based on the conditions on the ground. There are regions where land sparing might suit better, other regions where land sharing is better. Land use efficiency can be a very important driver to spare land. And this is also a solution for some of the areas. In other areas, we just need to combine agriculture and biodiversity on the ground. And regenerative agriculture is having a full portfolio of different solutions. It can also include crop diversity. We have talked a lot about our food system. We have too little crops. I mean, we need to increase the number of crops, the variety of crops on the ground. So there are ways to find compromises. And it's not black or white. I think we have to be smart and find the right balance between food security and the needs of nature and climate.
Yeah, thanks. I'll address the why, the claims, and that was sort of what I was. Good question, great questions, all of them. That was what I was trying to get to with the piece about what's the claim, what's the rationale for buying a credit or for investing in a credit, and in the corporate space. I think we're at this really interesting moment now where we've got these incredible frameworks for action around TNFD and around SBTN. So what is my risk looking like, and what do I have to disclose on that risk, and then what am I going to do about that risk, and what am I going to do about science-based targets for nature and addressing nature positive, helping contribute to a nature positive world. And it's all in play in terms of we haven't figured it all out yet, but there's a really strong opportunity to start talking about and looking and exploring how do biodiversity credits help mitigate systemic risk. There's risk in your supply chain, there's risk beyond your supply chain, there's risk beyond your business that you're going to have to deal with. And in both those cases, actually investing in biodiversity and having a tangible measure of what outcome you have had by investing in a nature-based solution that gives you biodiversity outcomes or whatever is going to be a very nice way of articulating what you are doing in a risk framework, but also what you're doing in a transformative framework like in SBTN, where you are going beyond your just keeping, like changing your business practices within your sphere of operations to what are you doing beyond your sphere of operations to be transformative in the world, to contribute to a nature positive world. So I think in various ways, I think this credit opportunity can play into that as an articulation of your contribution. And I'll just say one more, and what Tim and Mariana were talking about is it shows the innovation and the thinking in this space, and that is also playing into all of this about what am I measuring, what am I doing for biodiversity, if you call it a credit or not. We've got incredible innovation at the moment to thinking about how you can articulate that change over time, that improvement over time, or that avoided loss that we need in to be part of the nature positive trajectory. So thanks.
Yeah, I love this question about, if it's not an offset, why are they interested? I think we are really struggling with a set of problems that are that have at their heart a set of, what economists would call public goods, and any one actor doesn't have an interest individually, but together we all have an interest. And how do you really capture that individual action in the collective interest? One of the really fascinating things that I have found in WWF's work with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is we focus a lot on ensuring that impacts are clear and that companies understand the impacts that they're having. They're not really sure what their dependencies are, actually, unless it's something really obvious. So, a beverage company understands where there's water, where their water comes from, and what the quality of that water is. But if you are 1 or 2 steps away from that beverage company, they're deeply in your supply chain, you probably don't realize that that risk exists for you. And I think what that has really, that conversation, like the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, when companies have to start thinking about what they're reliant on and what their impacts are, both up and down their supply chains, that process of discovery really leads them to identify a whole set of things they were not aware of before, and presumably, and we have seen some evidence of this, act on that. So they will find increasingly that they actually do have a financial interest in investing in intact nature because it directly impacts their employees, it directly impacts their business model, it directly impacts their supply chain. I think once we press for more and more disclosure, the process that requires to get to that disclosure, we'll see a lot more interest that's really not just CSR interest, but financially self-interested.
Yeah, self-interest, if I just can pick up on that, also as, we are a part of a growing group of investors who have committed to assessing our biodiversity-related impact, to set targets and publicly report about it. And of course, as we make that commitment, we rely on our investees in terms of the data, the disclosures, and also understanding exactly, and that's a focus of our engagement, how do these issues play out in the supply chain, not just your own business. And it will never be limited just to the environmental aspect, but as was earlier mentioned, also very much so the social aspect of these developments.
I'll try to get a couple of more comments.
I'm conscious that we didn't answer the question from the Cargill. Was it Cargill? Sorry, yeah. Could you just, I want to just push back and ask you to articulate an example. So I've been sitting here reflecting on what you asked and trying to think, can I have an example of that? And maybe Tim might want to respond. No? Okay, maybe I shouldn't have brought it back up.
Sure. So, an example just off the top of my head, if you're thinking about a watershed, you may want to maximize soil moisture, water retention, and the vegetation in that watershed. And there's particular plant species that will be very effective at doing that. And there are other species that are poorer at doing that. And so if you maximize total biodiversity in that watershed, you may or may not maximize your water retention of the watershed. You may want to select particular species that are better at doing that and therefore have a lower overall biodiversity. And so I'm just wondering if there are ways that in the credit schemes that will ultimately be developed to account for trade-offs like that, where perhaps you would still get, you may want to increase biodiversity by 50% in that watershed and not by 100% because you want some flexibility to change the species composition to maximize your water outcome. And so maybe you would still want a very positive, yeah. So
okay.
So
okay,
I'm going to take the moderator's
yeah, go for it. No,
and get more comments and questions in. There was also on connecting with, let me go to that side as well, just for inclusive. Nicolas?
Hello, I'm Nicolas Galarza. I'm a visiting scholar at NYU, but I used to be the Vice Minister of Environment of Colombia. And given that government hat, I'd be curious in terms of given the development and the experience that you've had and the wonderful work that has been developed with numerous partners with the leadership of the forum, what's the role of governments in all this? Because we've seen how governments have been critically behind the development of carbon markets, and we're entering a much more complex arena with biodiversity, as you were mentioning. So I think all governments need some sort of hint in terms of what they need to do to actually facilitate that and not be really, really behind on the issue.
Let me get 2 more questions in the interest of time. Okay, Marcelo, and do you want to come a little further in front, and it would be easier? Very quickly.
Yes, very quickly. It's actually not a question, it's a suggestion. We keep saying it's complex, it's difficult, and I think we need to change our narrative. Financial sector does hyper transactions, does subprime trading, and we don't call it super complex and does something we should stay away. So my suggestion is that it's not saying that it's not complex, but it's just realizing that, for example, agricultural commodities market is a $4 trillion market. And we're talking about 700 billion gap. So I think it's about shaping what we want, and the discussion about biodiversity credits is moving us towards nature positive and equitable solutions, taking that into consideration.
Really brilliant point.
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Liliana Martinez. I'm from South Pole. We have been working on different initiatives related with biodiversity credits, and my question is more focused on the demand. And it's because, as you mentioned, we have different frameworks, we have different tools, we have different approaches, but sometimes the private sector feel a little bit confused with too much information and too much approaches that we have. So related with that, we believe that biodiversity market could be one of the ways to solve that, and agree one transactional unit could work. So my question is, do you consider that biodiversity market could solve this issue? And if yes, what do you think will be the next steps to do that? Thank you.
Okay, so I have the tough job that we only have, I think, 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to go around and ask each of the panelists to either choose to answer the question or weave that in your closing remarks. Would not want to get in trouble with Nature Positive Pavilion. So Anke, do you feel comfortable if we start with you?
Which question?
Your choice.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question to see what qualifies also for biodiversity credits at the end. It's also important to see that this will be an evolution. So we can learn something from the credit market, but we cannot apply the learnings one-to-one. And the question is sometimes really, can we bypass evolution? Or do we need to go through the learning altogether? Because there will be more challenges coming which we cannot foresee. And we have no time to lose. And some things we know that we can do them and that they are important. And my recommendation is to identify those issues where we know that this is good, and we can work on it, we have solutions, and that we incentivize them, that these are done. And on the go, we are learning more and more and applying this learning, not making the systems too firm, because there might be new learnings on the go, and we have to keep the systems flexible to do good overall. So that is my recommendation. Learning together, building up trust, and embracing also complexity, because life is complex, and we have digital tools and services which can manage complexity for us. We need to prioritize, apply also the science-based target logic to the farmer's reality, because that fits also very well to farmers. But prioritization is important, and once a priority has been identified, why don't we incentivize then the farmers to apply basically the measures to manage them better? So I think it's, we have all the tools at hand, and it's affordable. There are some examples. For example, Lantmännen in Sweden has decided as a food chain to be the first fully decarbonized food chain. It's possible. They made an inventory. They found out that they have to decarbonize the fertilizer, that they have to enhance the nitrogen use efficiency, use non-fossil fuel. And now, next year, they will start with their new production. And they made a consumer survey. The consumers are happy to pay. And it's only a few pence for a loaf of bread, you know. It's affordable. So I think we need also more optimism in this whole transformation. Many things are possible, and we have to start as soon as possible and not lose time. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll try and weave a couple of responses back. So when I said getting comfortable with complexity, what I meant, thank you Marcelo, very good point, was that it's about articulating complexity in a simple way. You know, I use my cell phone every day. I have no idea how it works. I'm sure it's very complicated, but it sort of works for me, you know. And so I think that segues to the question for South Pole, is that there's great innovation. And I think there's the way we're starting to think about how you measure biodiversity and how you articulate that measurement, and then what can I do with it? How can I articulate that? What framework? Can I talk about risk? Can I talk about nature positive trajectory? Can I talk about contribution? Is very exciting, because I think we're starting to get a lot of innovation in that thinking, and the idea here is not to be yet too prescriptive about how you define a credit, but to open that up to innovation and thinking about, well, how can this really work at a local level, at a global level? And in that comes a lot of interest from new stakeholders, from corporates, to learn as they're on their learning journey, from investors. So I think that is really important. But playing on the complexity bit, I would say that what we're trying to do here with the biodiversity credit piece is to restore complexity in systems, to restore integrity, to have holistic approaches so that that ecosystem delivers multiple benefits and multiple services to people, and to nature itself. So I'd be a little worried if we're starting to think about separate ecosystem service outcomes rather than the integrity of the system as a whole. Because, hey, I think we underestimate nature. We think we know it all, but we don't. And when we've put integrity back into that system, we're going to get so much more value. And I think that's what we're trying to articulate now with these credits. But you have got me thinking about that one, so let's talk. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to finish up by responding to that question about what governments should do. Because it's governments that set the policy framework, and you know, especially since we're here in Montreal to discuss the global biodiversity framework, we need a clear direction, we need clear goals, clear targets, because that sets the framework against which all of these private sector discussions then fit in. So we need that clear direction from governments. That global biodiversity framework needs to be rights-based in order to work. That's especially important for a conversation like this, because many of the stewards of nature around the world currently don't have rights, and it's really hard to get financial resources to them in that sort of context. We also need for the governments in that context of the alignment really to think about how to reform and redirect harmful subsidies so that those funds actually facilitate the transition to a 1.5 degree world, to a world that delivers on the Sustainable Development Goals, to a world where we have intact and thriving nature. And then the last point is that this is just one tool, and I think every time we discuss one tool, we tend to vest all of our hopes in it, and we really need to understand that it's just one tool. We have lots of tools to facilitate finance to nature, and we need to be careful not to hope that this solves everything. Recognize what it may be able to solve and support its development in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, you know, the policymakers and regulators, governments have a very important role to play, but it is also, that's why we have probably the largest finance delegation at a COP here, because that engagement is so crucial for everyone. And that's perhaps what I would like to stress, is the common interest. You sort of started off by saying there's nature and there is finance. But the two, actually the financial sector, has a very strong interest and a very strong commitment in this area, but we need to work together with those who are really on the ground, are doing these fascinating projects. And it strikes me that biodiversity credits, they're one area of innovation, and they could also be linked to a lot of technology innovation, and that in and of itself could become another investment opportunity. So there's this whole ecosystem of investments that I think could come from it. And perhaps, if I may suggest, you know, look at the financial sector as a partner in this journey, and yeah, excited about seeing where it takes us.
Thank you so much, everybody. I know we are 5 minutes over, so I won't take too much time. But one, just looking at everybody gathered here, you know it's a good group of people when you have as many experts in the audience as you have on the panel. So I hope we can continue some of these conversations while we are here in Montreal, but also afterwards. The entire session was raising constantly the point on integrity, both of ecosystems, but also the relationship that it has with local communities, with ecosystems and nature on the ground. And understanding from what has worked in other markets and what also hasn't worked in other markets is where do you start from and what do you shoehorn in later. And it's important that we start from the fact that this is all for the outcome at the end of having stronger nature and more equitable people on the ground. So I just want to say a big, big thanks to the entire panel and many of you here because this is an ongoing conversation. We have a consultation paper for the high integrity principles for the biodiversity credits markets, and the aim would be to put it out in public domain for further consultation, say around February or so. So welcome engagement and interaction on that from everybody. So if I may, as closing, request you to give a big round of applause to the wonderful panel. Thank you.